In a moment that stunned the international community, Ibrahim Traoré, the young and defiant leader of Burkina Faso, stood at the podium of the United Nations General Assembly and delivered what would become known as his most powerful and final warning to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This moment has already been etched into history, not only for the words he spoke, but also for the conviction and courage with which he delivered them. In this video, we're going to take you through what exactly happened, what led up to this dramatic moment, what Traoré said, and how the world reacted to it. The General Assembly Hall was packed that day. Delegates, journalists, and observers leaned forward, aware that Traoré, known for his fiery speeches and no-nonsense demeanor, was expected to make a statement about the ongoing situation in Gaza, Palestine, and the broader Middle East. Over the past year, tensions between Israel and several African nations had escalated, especially after a series of strikes that left hundreds of civilians dead in Gaza. Traoré had been one of the few African heads of state to openly condemn Israel's actions, calling them blatant violations of human rights and international law. In the weeks prior to this speech, Burkina Faso had cut some diplomatic channels with Israel and joined calls for sanctions. Many assumed that Traoré would simply repeat his earlier criticisms, but what followed was far more pointed and shocking. As Traoré approached the podium, his presence commanded the room. Only 37 years old, he was already a figure many described as Africa's voice of defiance. He began calmly, thanking the assembly for the opportunity to speak on behalf of his nation. Then, he turned to the subject of Gaza. His voice grew more forceful as he described the images of destruction: children buried under rubble, families displaced, hospitals bombed. He painted a harrowing picture of what he called the daily reality of a people who have been denied dignity for decades. Traoré paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Then came the line that would grab headlines around the globe. Looking directly toward the Israeli delegation seated across the room, he declared, Mr. Netanyahu, this is your final warning. The patience of humanity has limits. The patience of Africa has limits. And the patience of Burkina Faso has limits. If you continue down this path of injustice and bloodshed, you will find yourself without allies, without legitimacy, and without a future in the community of nations. Gasps could be heard throughout the hall. Delegates exchanged glances. Some erupted into applause, while others sat frozen, unsure how to respond to such a blunt condemnation delivered in such a diplomatic setting. Traoré continued, We are no longer in an age where powerful nations can oppress others with impunity. The world sees, the world knows, and Africa is no longer silent. We will not stand idly by as you erase an entire people from the earth. If international law does not restrain you, history will judge you, and so will we. He ended his speech by calling on the UN to immediately enforce resolutions demanding a ceasefire and to hold accountable those responsible for war crimes. We are not calling for revenge, he said. We are calling for justice. Without justice, there can never be peace. Without peace, none of us are safe. After finishing his remarks, Traoré stepped down, and the hall erupted into a mixture of cheers, clapping, and murmurs of disbelief. The Israeli delegation quickly left the room without making a comment. The reaction from around the world was swift. On social media, clips of Traoré's speech went viral within hours. Hashtags like #TRAORE warning and #final warning trended worldwide. Many hailed him as a hero, a young African leader unafraid to speak truth to power. Others criticized him for what they saw as an overly aggressive tone in a setting meant for diplomacy. In Africa, The response was overwhelmingly positive. Citizens in Burkina Faso, Mali, Senegal, and South Africa poured into the streets to celebrate his courage, waving flags and holding signs that read, "Africa stands with Palestine and Traore speaks for us all." In Israel, however, government officials called the speech a gross violation of diplomatic protocol and accused Traore of incitement. Netanyahu himself responded later that evening in a press conference, dismissing Traore's remarks as empty threats and reaffirming his government's commitment to what he called Israel's security and right to self-defense. But, for many observers, the speech marked a turning point. For decades, African nations had often stayed quiet or neutral in Middle Eastern conflicts, focusing instead on internal challenges. But Traore, a leader from a small landlocked nation, had demonstrated that Africa could and would take a moral stand on global issues and demand to be heard. What makes Traore's warning even more significant is the context in which he delivered it. He himself came to power by overthrowing a government that many saw as a puppet of Western interests. Since then, he's positioned himself as a champion of sovereignty and independence, not just for Burkina Faso, but for all of Africa. His boldness in confronting France, the European Union, and even the United States over issues of neocolonialism had already won him admirers. But his willingness to stand up to Israel, and by extension, the United States, which has been Israel's closest ally, was seen as a whole new level of defiance. In the weeks that followed, Burkina Faso announced that it would join calls for an arms embargo against Israel and pushed for the African Union to take a firmer stance on Palestine. Other African leaders, inspired by Traore's speech, began issuing their own statements of solidarity with Palestine. Some analysts warn that Traore's approach could isolate Burkina Faso diplomatically and economically. Already, some aid programs from Western nations have been put on hold. But within Burkina Faso, Traore's popularity has soared. Citizens see him as a leader who refuses to bow down, who speaks for the oppressed, and who isn't afraid to risk everything for justice. In his own words, as he told reporters after the speech, "If we are silent in the face of injustice, we are complicit. My people did not elect me to be complicit." The impact of Traore's final warning is still unfolding. What is certain is that his words have ignited a conversation, not just about Israel and Palestine, but about the role Africa can play in shaping the global order. Whether Netanyahu and his government will heed the warning remains to be seen. But Traore has already made it clear he's not afraid to speak, and he's not afraid to act. His final words that day still resonate. Africa will no longer be silent, and the world must listen. And with that, he left the stage, leaving behind a stunned audience, a shaken UN, and a message that may shape the future of international diplomacy for years to come. This was the moment Traore shocked the UN and delivered his final warning to Netanyahu. The world had barely recovered from the shock of Ibrahim Traoré's fiery warning to Netanyahu when, just a few months later, he made headlines again, this time by confronting the leaders of the European Union at a high-level summit in Brussels. The summit was supposed to strengthen Africa-EU relations and discuss economic cooperation. But Traore had a very different agenda. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries, speeches about partnership, mutual development, and shared goals. EU leaders spoke at length about aid programs, trade deals, and supporting democracy in Africa. Many African heads of state nodded politely, and some thanked their European counterparts for the promises of assistance. But when it was Traore's turn to speak, the room fell silent. Everyone knew by now that he didn't mince words. Standing. Tall at the podium, he started calmly, acknowledging Europe's long history of engagement with Africa. But his tone quickly shifted as he laid bare what he called the uncomfortable truths of the relationship. For too long, he began, Europe has treated Africa not as a partner, but as a prize. You speak of aid while extracting our wealth. You speak of democracy while propping up regimes that serve your interests. You speak of partnership, yet our people remain in chains, economic chains, political chains, and military chains. The European leaders shifted uneasily in their seats. Cameras captured German Chancellor and French President exchanging nervous glances. Traore went on. You talk of helping Africa fight terrorism, but you fail to mention that many of those terrorists were created by your wars, your weapons, your interference in our affairs. You offer loans and call it aid, but those loans come with conditions that cripple our economies for generations. You build military bases on our soil under the guise of protection, but what you really protect are your corporations, your pipelines, your mining interests. He paused to let the weight of his words sink in. Then he dropped what many later called the Brussels bombshell. Effective immediately, he announced, Burkina Faso will no longer allow foreign military bases on its territory. Effective. Immediately, we will nationalize our gold and mineral industries and ensure the wealth of our land serves our people first. Effective immediately, we call on our African brothers and sisters to do the same, to stand up and reclaim our dignity. Gasps and murmurs swept through the hall. Some African leaders clapped quietly, while others looked down. Afraid to show support in front of their European benefactors, Traore didn't stop there. Europe, he said, his voice rising, you cannot claim to be our friend while keeping your knee on our neck. If you truly want partnership, then respect us as equals. If not, Africa will find its own way forward, with or without you. By the time he finished, the room was in stunned silence. Then came a smattering of applause, growing louder as younger delegates and observers joined in. Later that evening, headlines across Europe and Africa blared. Traore stuns EU with call for African independence. Burkina Faso expels foreign troops, nationalizes mines, and Africa rising, Traore's new vision. In the days that followed, several West African countries announced reviews of their own agreements with European nations. In Mali and Niger, crowds took to the streets waving Burkinabé flags alongside their own, chanting Traore's name and demanding change. European governments scrambled to respond. The French Foreign Ministry called his remarks unhelpful. The EU Commission issued a cautious statement saying it regretted the tone of Traore's speech but remained committed to dialogue. But among ordinary Africans, Traore's words struck a chord. On social media, clips of his speech went viral again, with hashtags like #AfricaForAfricans and #TRAOR speaks trending across the continent. In Burkina Faso, his popularity soared even higher. For many, he had become a symbol of a new Africa, bold, unapologetic, and unafraid to stand up to former colonial powers. Critics warned that his decisions would hurt Burkina Faso's economy and isolate it diplomatically, but Traore remained firm. Speaking to journalists after the summit, he said, we will not be slaves in our own house. If independence means hardship, then we accept it. If freedom has a price, then we will pay it. But we will no longer sell our souls for crumbs. That night, as Traore boarded his plane back to Ouagadougou, he looked out at the Brussels skyline one last time. Aides said he smiled slightly and murmured to himself, They will remember this day, and so will Africa. Asterisk once again, Traore had delivered a message the world couldn't ignore, proving that the young leader from a small African nation was not just a voice for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent on the rise. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Barely 6 months after his fiery showdown at the European Union summit, Ibrahim Traoré shocked the world yet again. This time, at the annual World Economic Forum in Davos. Asterisk, the snow-covered Swiss resort was, as usual, a gathering place for billionaires, world leaders, and corporate executives. Every January, Davos became the stage where the most powerful people on Earth made speeches about the future of the global economy. Many of these speeches were full of promises about tackling inequality and building a sustainable world, yet year after year, little seemed to change. But this year things would be different. Traoré arrived at Davos to little fanfare. Many doubted he would even attend, given his disdain for what he once called elite theater. But his office had issued a cryptic statement the week before, saying only, "Africa has something to say." Asterisk, on the morning of his speech, the conference hall was packed. Attendees murmured quietly as Traoré took the stage, not in the designer suits that filled the room, but in a traditional Burkinabe tunic and scarf. He walked confidently to the podium and began his address. He wasted no time. "I look around this room," he said, scanning the sea of powerful faces, "and I see the architects of the system that is suffocating the world." Asterisk, the audience stiffened. Cameras turned to catch the reaction of CEOs and presidents as Traoré continued. Asterisk, "You gather here every year and speak of climate change. Yet your companies poison our rivers, strip our forests, and burn our skies. You speak of fighting poverty, yet your wealth depends on the cheap labor of our children in mines. You speak of equality, yet your banks trap our nations in debt while your corporations drain our resources." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud. "You say you want to save the planet? Start by getting your boots off our necks. Stop financing wars in our lands. Stop stealing our gold, our cobalt, our oil. Stop imposing policies that keep us weak and dependent so you can stay rich and powerful." Traoré's voice rose. "I'm here to tell you, Africa is awake. Africa is standing. And Africa will no longer carry the weight of your greed on our backs." Asterisk, a few in the audience clapped nervously. Others glared. But Traoré pressed on. Asterisk, he described his vision for a self-sufficient Africa, one where nations cooperated with each other instead of competing for scraps. He spoke of creating a Pan-African currency, breaking away from the World Bank and IMF, and building trade and investment networks that served African interests first. Asterisk, he even proposed a controversial idea, a global tax on multinational corporations that profit from natural resources in the global south to be administered by the United Nations. The proceeds, he said, should fund education, healthcare, and infrastructure in the countries from which the wealth was extracted. Asterisk, if you truly care about sustainability, he declared, then it is time to repay your debt to humanity, the debt you owe to the billions who toil so you can live in luxury. His final words sent a chill through the room. You speak of the future as if it belongs to you. But I tell you this, the future belongs to those who are willing to fight for it, and Africa is ready to fight. Asterisk, he left the stage to stunned silence. A few young delegates rose to clap. Then more joined in. Soon the room was ringing with applause, though many of the world's richest and most powerful sat stone-faced, their expressions unreadable. Asterisk, in the hours that followed, Traoré's speech became the top story on every news channel. On social media, his words lit a fire. Young people across Africa, Latin America, and Asia shared clips of his address with hashtags like #AfricaRising, #Traore at Davos, and #GlobalJustice. In the boardrooms of multinational corporations, however, his words were met with anger. Several CEOs publicly criticized him, calling his remarks unproductive and divisive. A few even threatened to suspend operations in Burkina Faso and other West African countries. But Traore didn't flinch. Speaking to reporters on his way out of Davos, he simply said, "I am not here to make friends. I am here to speak the truth. If the truth makes them uncomfortable, that is not my problem." The next day, he flew back to Ouagadougou to a hero's welcome. Thousands lined the streets waving Burkinabe flags and chanting his name. Across the continent, young activists organized rallies and forums under the slogan, "Another world is possible. Africa will lead." Traore's speech at Davos became another defining moment in his journey. A symbol of defiance in a world where the voices of the oppressed are too often drowned out by the powerful. Once again, he had shown the world that he was more than just the leader of a small African nation. He was becoming the conscience of a continent, and perhaps of the entire global South. And as he told a cheering crowd upon his return, "They wanted me to come to Davos and stay quiet. Instead, I told them the truth. And that is only the beginning." After his searing speech at Davos shook the foundations of the world's economic elite, Ibrahim Traoré turned his attention inward toward Africa itself. For years he had spoken about the dream of a truly united Africa, one that would rise above colonial borders, foreign interference, and internal divisions to become a global power in its own right. That dream took shape at the historic African Union Extraordinary Summit on Continental Unity. Held in Addis Ababa. The summit was called to discuss growing instability across the Sahel, the economic crises facing several member states, and the increasing calls from African youth for greater sovereignty. But Traoré arrived in Addis with a much bolder agenda, nothing less than the formation of a United States of Africa. The summit hall was draped in the green, gold, and red of the O flag. Leaders from all 55 member states filled the seats, some skeptical, some hopeful, many simply curious to see what Traoré would say. He didn't disappoint. When his turn to speak came, Traoré walked to the center of the stage, dressed again in a simple traditional tunic with the Burkinabe flag pinned to his chest, and stood silently for a moment, looking out at the assembled presidents and prime ministers. Then he spoke. "My brothers, my sisters, my fellow Africans. For 60 years we have called ourselves free. But what freedom is this? When our currencies are still controlled from Paris? When our economies are dictated by Washington and Brussels? When our skies are patrolled by foreign drones and our children die in wars fueled by outsiders? We are free only in name, not in reality. And today, I say, that must end." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Traoré continued, "Why do we beg for aid when we sit on the world's richest lands? Why do we trade with each other less than we trade with Europe? Why do our young people risk drowning in the Mediterranean because they see no future here? We have been divided for too long, divided by the lines they drew on our maps, by the lies they whispered in our ears, by the chains they still hide in their hands. But no more." Traoré paused, then delivered his vision. "I stand before you today to call for the creation of a United States of Africa, one currency, one passport, one military, one government that speaks with one voice for 1.4 billion Africans. A continent that no longer bows to foreign powers, but sets its own destiny." The hall erupted into applause. Some leaders clapped politely. Others, notably the presidents of Mali, Guinea, and South Africa, rose to their feet, cheering, but there were also frowns and whispers. Some feared such unity was impossible. Others, who owed their power to ties with foreign nations, saw Traore's proposal as a direct threat. He addressed them directly. To those who say we cannot, I say, look at Europe. Look at the United States. If they can unite despite centuries of bloodshed, why can't we? Are we less capable? Are we less human? No. We are Africa, and Africa is ready. Over the next 2 hours, Traore laid out his plan in detail. Creation of an African central bank and a single African currency to replace the CFA franc and other colonial-era currencies. The establishment of an African continental armed forces to defend African sovereignty and end dependence on NATO, and foreign militaries. The implementation of a continental passport, allowing free movement of Africans across all borders, and the drafting of an African constitution, guaranteeing human rights, economic justice, and unity. He closed with words that would be quoted across the continent for weeks. We are 1.4 billion hearts beating as one. We are 30 million square kilometers of strength, of hope, of promise. The future is ours if we dare to claim it, so let us dare. When he stepped down from the podium, the room thundered with applause. Young African diplomats and observers in the galleries chanted his name. In the hours that followed, the summit broke into heated debates. Some nations immediately pledged support. Others demanded more time. A few walked out. But for the first time in decades, the idea of African unity no longer felt like a distant dream. It felt alive, real, possible. Across the continent, reactions poured in. Markets wavered, unsure of what the future would bring. In cities from Dakar to Kinshasa, crowds filled the streets waving African flags and chanting, "One Africa, one destiny." Foreign powers watched warily. European and American officials called for caution and warned of destabilizing ambitions. But Traore seemed unfazed. Speaking to reporters the next day, he said simply, "Destiny does not wait for permission, and neither will Africa." Over the coming months, a coalition of African nations led by Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea, and South Africa began laying the groundwork for a Continental Congress to draft the first Constitution of the United States of Africa. And though the road ahead was long and uncertain, one thing was clear. The young captain from Ouagadougou had once again ignited a fire. The dream of African unity, once thought impossible, was now within reach, thanks to the bold vision of a leader unafraid to speak, to act, and to dream. And as Traore said in his final words at the summit, "The world has divided us long enough. Today we begin to unite." Following his historic call for a United States of Africa, Ibrahim Traoré once again made headlines on the world stage, this time by boldly confronting NATO itself over its increasing military presence in African skies and waters. For years, NATO had quietly expanded its operations across the Sahel, Red Sea, and Indian Ocean under the pretext of counterterrorism and maritime security. Burkinabe officials, however, began documenting dozens of unauthorized drone flights, covert troop landings, and naval exercises in what they called a systematic violation of African sovereignty. Traore decided to put an end to it. The confrontation came at the NATO-African Security Dialogue held in Istanbul. The conference was meant to build trust between NATO and African nations, but Traore came with a different agenda entirely. Asterisk he arrived in Istanbul to a frenzy of cameras and reporters. Everyone suspected he would deliver another uncompromising speech, but no one was prepared for just how far he would go. Asterisk as the NATO Secretary General opened the session, speaking about partnership and shared security challenges, Traore sat quietly at his seat, a stoic expression on his face. When his turn came to speak, he walked to the podium, slowly adjusted the microphone, and began. Let me begin, he said, by reminding you that Africa is not your battlefield. Africa is not your laboratory. Africa is not your chessboard. He paused, letting his words settle over the stunned room. For decades, he continued, we have watched NATO wage wars in the name of peace. We have watched you topple governments in the name of democracy. We have watched you bomb cities in the name of security. And we have seen the price paid not by you, but by the people you claim to protect. Traore's eyes swept across the room, locking onto the NATO delegation. You speak of terrorism in Africa. But who armed the groups that terrorize us? You speak of piracy in our waters. But who plundered our fish and dumped toxic waste on our coasts? You speak of instability. But who destabilized Libya, leaving a wound that bleeds across our continent? To this day? Do not pretend you do not know the answer. The answer is sitting in this room. A ripple of shock spread through the audience. The NATO Secretary General shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Then came the moment that would dominate headlines for weeks. Traore pulled out a folder and held it high. This, he said, is documented evidence of unauthorized NATO operations in Burkinabe airspace, on Burkinabe soil, and in African waters. We did not invite you. We did not approve this. You violated our sovereignty. And today, I serve you notice. If one more NATO drone flies over Burkina Faso, it will be shot down. If one more NATO warship enters our waters without permission, it will be turned back. If one more NATO soldier sets foot on our soil without consent, he will be detained. Africa is not your colony. Africa is not your base. Africa is not your war. The hall fell silent except for the faint hum of cameras clicking and recording. Traore lowered the folder, leaned into the microphone, and delivered his final words. We are not afraid of you. You should be afraid of what happens when Africa unites and says, enough. With that, he left the podium, his scarf billowing behind him as he strode back to his seat. For several seconds, no one moved. Then a smattering of applause came from the African delegations, growing louder until half the hall was clapping. The NATO delegation, meanwhile, sat frozen, their faces a mixture of disbelief and anger. Later that day, Traore held a press conference, where he doubled down. Burkina Faso is prepared to defend its skies, its land, and its people, he declared. We do not want war, but we will not bow to intimidation, and we will not allow Africa to be used as NATO's playground. His defiance electrified audiences across Africa. In Dakar, young people marched through the streets waving signs that read, our skies, our seas, our land, and Traore speaks for Africa. In Nairobi, students painted murals of Traore with the words Africa First. In European and American capitals, his speech sparked frantic discussions. NATO officials downplayed his remarks publicly, but behind closed doors admitted they were concerned. One diplomat was quoted anonymously as saying, he has lit a fire we may not be able to put out. Traore, however, seemed unbothered. When asked by a journalist if he feared NATO retaliation, he smiled faintly and replied, we fear only one thing, the silence of our own people, but now they are awake. And so we are not afraid. Asterisk in the weeks that followed, several other Sahel nations began pushing back against NATO overflights and joint operations, demanding transparency and consent. Asterisk, and once again, Traore had demonstrated to the world that Africa could and would stand up for itself, even against the most powerful military alliance in history. Asterisk, he left Istanbul to the chance of African students waiting outside the venue. Asterisk, defender of the skies, defender of the land, defender of Africa. And as he boarded his plane back to Ouagadougou, he told his aides quietly, "This is just the beginning. Let them know Africa is not for sale."